Well, ladies and gentlemen, we have Mr. Jason Gregory with us tonight. He has a wonderful new book coming out, and I think it's going to be out this October. Is that correct, Jason?
Yeah, that's correct.
And it's called The Science and the Practice of Humility. We had Jason on just a week ago, and because so many people were enjoying Jason's message, they asked us if we could have him back on this week, and lo and behold, we do indeed. And like I shared with everybody last week, this is truly an international show because we have Ms. Liara Covert, my co-host from the land down under, the land of Oz, and we have Mr. Jason Gregory, who's sitting in the wonderful country of Thailand, and of course myself in the United States and the area known as Northern Nevada. So this is truly an international show and an international interaction. That being said, Jason, if you had to put in a nutshell, what would be, and I'm going to put this in basically two questions, the science of humility and then the practice of humility. How would you...
That's a good question.
Go ahead.
That's a good question. Well, first of all, you have to think about science in different terms because obviously in the modern day we think about science as a form of method or observation and experimentation. But when you look back into ancient times, especially within the wisdom traditions, you see science is thought of very differently. So when we look at, say for instance, to explain this, when you look at the Latin scientia is the root of the word science, meaning knowledge, and it also comes from the other Latin word named scire, which means to know. So really this means ultimate experiential knowledge, you could say, which is common in when we think about gnosis in the mystery schools, in Gnosticism and Hermeticism, and also the original science has more relation to, you could say, omniscient, which means to have complete or ultimate knowledge and awareness of an understanding of all things. So not just only yourself, but also the external realm. And so you could say that the science of humility has more resonance with, you could say, the Hindu Vedanta system, where Vedanta is a philosophy known as the science of self-realization. But the difference between that is the science of humility is the science of what Vedanta are seeking to achieve, meaning that authentic humility that comes through an individual. And so that's the science of it. And you could say the practice of it is just to live in that. But it is much more difficult to explain in our show. That kind of is that in a nutshell. So we really have to think about science in different terms, especially when we consider that, like I said, that science itself is more relational to experiential knowledge, not so much knowledge observed and experimented upon. So
I have a seeming odd question for you, and I'm really going to be intrigued by your response to it. But when we are seeking something like knowledge, seeking something like humility, when we're looking for things like that, how humble actually are we during this, so to speak, quote, search of it? Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And it depends on, I suppose, where that individual is on their own path, because, again, when you're searching for knowledge and you have a yearning to know more about yourself and the world, if you don't sort of come to the plate with an empty basket, then you might be a bit rigid upon a lot of things you discover in that sort of journey of knowledge, because a lot of things that we do learn about ourselves and the world do conflict a lot with our own conditioning and the way we think about the world. So it is a humbling process. There's no doubt about it. When you do go onto this journey of self-discovery, there's a lot of things that do clear out of a lot of your own hypnosis, and it is a humbling experience. And to get to that true state of humility, it should be more of a receptive process as well. Like it's more of Well, when you see someone who's really in that state of authentic humility, it's a vertical openness, you could say. It's very receptive, and there are no sort of dogmas tying one to even their own conditioned belief on the spiritual path, you could say.
Well, anytime there's conditioning thrown onto something, to me, that's subject to question. But another thing that runs through my mind is that when we are on this spiritual path, we're automatically, I would think, going to get into conflict with ourselves, are we not? And is that not caused by the idea of the illusion, if you will, of the warrior mind, the warrior state, the conditioned state?
Yep. You're going to... Well, there is going to be a lot of conflict, especially if you're only dwelling within that warrior state of consciousness, like you said, Steve, and it's... and to articulate that for the listeners is that in the book I sort of describe the two primary states of awareness, where we have the warrior state of consciousness and the sages of consciousness, meaning that the warrior is perpetually caught in the detail of life, meaning the drama of existence. So they're always attracted to political dramas or social dramas, always from a standpoint of their own conditioning as well. Like they are always trying to project their own idea of the world, which is usually based on their conditioning and pleasures upon others. And then if all we need to do to ask ourselves sincerely is, if we are to do that, how can that achieve peace and harmony in the world? And it cannot, because Stephen Hairfield sees the world differently to I. But can we come together mutually? Of course we can. But we can only do that unless we have, in a sense, worked through that warrior state of consciousness. Not to say that the warrior state of consciousness is an incorrect way of perception. It's always going to be there. There's always going to be that focus on the detail, in a sense, even in your own life. Even a sage has that. They might have to pay the bills, you could say. But the difference is, with the sage, it's not attached to. The sage, they sort of see reality from a high...
And it's actually the attachment, is it not?
Yeah, it's the attachment. It is. It's the attachment to the ideas that you have of the world, everything about it. In spirituality, or in a lot of wisdom traditions, they speak about renunciation. Now, renunciation itself is being confused in a sense that people renounce the world physically. Now, there is a symbolic thing about that, but the true renunciation is to renounce the concepts and the ideas and everything that you have built within your own mind and projected them onto the world. Can you renounce that? Now, that's what a sage is.
Isn't that the box that we build ourselves into?
Definitely is. That's definitely the box we've built ourselves into. And it's more of a prison than anything else, because most people can't escape that. Most people still firmly believe that they are from their own country or their own religion, or thoroughly believe in the employment they have and this and that. Now, there's nothing to say that there's anything wrong with that. But when you firmly believe in it, there's a belief in the identity that is a destructive one for the world, because it's you against the world then.
Identity is a limiting idea, is it not?
It is a limiting idea. And it's a limiting idea, like I said, it's more so the belief in the identity, because it's not so bad to have an identity, but when you firmly believe in that identity and you think that that's who you are, then that's when the trouble will occur. That's when you come to the world with a ton of agendas for the world. And, we can work through that conditioning. We can work through that warrior mind and see reality from the state of a sage, to see it from above, and to see that what was once thought of as chaotic, in a sense, is harmonious. But that doesn't mean that you are a dehumanist towards reality. You have more compassion and more forgiveness, because you understand that the warrior mind itself is just deluded. It's constantly going to be in conflict when you have an agenda to push.
I'm going to ask you to hang on to that thought for a moment, Jason, if you wouldn't mind.
Yep.
And I'm going to seemingly go off on a tangent, but we'll see if we can't tie all this together. in the eastern part of the world, there's a saying. It's called the bodhisattva. What a bodhisattva is a person that has achieved godhood, which is all of our own birthright to achieve. But in that, there's a saying that says essentially this, that when one is on the journey of the path of the bodhisattva, or achieving their own godhood, they will encounter enemies. And when we see our enemies as our teacher, and we honor them as that teacher, then our enemies go away. We have more internal enemies than we ever do external enemies. And I think in the idea of the warrior mind, that is the thing that is always presenting to us the idea of enemies. But if we saw those ideas of the warrior mind as a teacher, Jason, wouldn't that lead us to the sage mind?
Definitely would, because you've taken the focus from who you believe is the perceived enemy to the real enemy, which is the warrior mind, you could say, within ourselves. It's that is where the orientation needs to turn, because what we perceive as our enemy in the world, in a sense, is not. It's the way we see the world, and everything that my work sort of focuses upon is the way that we perceive the world. Because if we were to change the way we perceive the world, then there is something in that. Now, like what you said, Stephen, that is an avenue.
Maybe that's what Gandhi meant when he said, "Be the change which you wish to see in the world."
Yeah, you definitely can say that, and I think that Gandhi, he probably saw from that place, because his life is testament to it. And it's achievable by anyone, but again, like what you said, people have to reorientate their focus to the real enemy. And the real enemy is the warrior mind, the conditioned mind, that separates you from the environment. And meaning that getting out of the label of things and understanding yourself, and then come back fresh and try to understand the things in the world.
Well, the whole idea of separation, Jason, is something Christ himself threw out there, and everybody knows I'm not a religious human, but when he said, "A house divided cannot stand against itself," the idea of separation itself creates the illusion of conflict. And us humans are always looking for conflict in life, conflict with ourselves, conflict with our personal view of who we tend to, and here I'm going to say this, and who we tend to think we are, when what we're thinking, and I'm going to ask you this, Jason, is more in relation to who we are not. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and that's exactly how it is, Stephen. And the conflict that we have within ourselves is the one that we project onto the world. And it's only when you go into your own self-work and you try to understand that conflict and to understand the warrior mind that you'll achieve a state of equanimity within yourself. And it's only then that you can approach the world. And this is the problem in politics and institutions like that, because a lot of people have not done any work on themselves, and they come into a realm such as politics, and how can we not expect war from these people? Because that's all you can expect. And this is the age-old analogy for China, because in Taoist philosophy, they always say that if only sage was a king, but it has never happened in our history, because it's always, a sage's, you could say they could be bothered about that, but because things are harmonious already, we don't need to exactly perpetuate and project ourselves upon the world if we are doing the work within ourselves.
Well, but see, to me, the warrior mind is stimulated by the idea of projection of ourselves onto the world, and then we compound that with the world projecting itself on us. That creates the idea of the conflict, does it not?
It does, yeah, and that creates the idea of an isolated individual too, someone who thinks that they are isolated from the whole universe, which is an interesting concept, but it's going to remain a concept.
Indeed, because how could you be isolated from the entire universe when you're the one that realizes it in the first place?
Exactly, but see, people aren't thinking deeply enough on that because they see it's the perception that they have of reality, like what you're saying, Stephen, that they cannot fathom because it is them against the world. It's not them belonging to the world. And again, this arises from the warrior mind and the conflict. And you would know from your work in Buddhism and in Zen, especially in Zen, it's not to fracture yourself within, but to try and build yourself wholly within, to be integral within, to understand that warrior mind, not to cast it aside, but to integrate it into your own.
See, to me, the truth is I'm not sure we can ever get really, or even if we would want to, and maybe you can correct me on this, do we ever really want to get rid of the warrior part of us? I think no. It's the time when we use that warrior side, so to speak. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. And I get into this in the book, actually, where I say, I speak about the warrior mind, that it's not something that we can cast aside because we can't. It's an aspect of the universe that's there, and to try and articulate this, I always turn to the Hindu pantheon, where they describe the breath of Brahma, meaning the expansion and the contraction of consciousness. Now, basically, that relates to the warrior and the sage's state of perception, meaning that a warrior's focus is always directly on the detail of life, and the sage's perception is far back above and can see the harmonious pattern. So one is in the chaos and one is in the order. So it's almost like an in-breath and an out-breath. Meaning that we cannot hold to the out-breath and we cannot hold to the in-breath. It has to be a flux, an in and an out, an in and an out. But you could say what the sage has mastered is they're not totally fixed on the reality. They hold more back to the grander perspective. So, like what you said, it's not that we can cast aside the warrior mind because, in a sense, it's needed for some aspects in the world, and it keeps the world ticking over. It keeps doing, the world's dynamic. There is no one path for the world. There's many paths, but one truth. So, there is the influx and the outflux of life.
Indeed, but we're allowing that flow, so the sage allows the flow. So for the listening audience, it's allowing for that natural, harmonious flow of life with the aspect of not, what can we say, I don't know if I want to use the word interfering, because like you say in your book, language is a very limiting idea. Language in and of itself, when we look at language and linguistics, it is and can be a very limiting idea. Does that make sense? It
does make sense, and I get into that in the book, Steve, and and language itself is you can say a tool of duality. It's you and I are using it now, and we are speaking about terminology and concepts and everything put into that field, and hopefully we are coming to a ground of consensual seeing on that, whereas language itself, even the use of some words, even if you were to say consciousness, that means 1,000 different things for millions of different people. So again, we don't have a consensual view on even terminology in this world. So it's not to say that language itself is bad. It's just that we have language, and language is a great thing. It's a beautiful thing, but it doesn't encapsulate the essence of something that you're trying to say in itself. We could look at a tree, but you can say that's a tree, but that doesn't really categorically define what a tree is. You're just sort of projecting your own idea of what a thing is.
Whether it's a pear tree or an apple tree or whatever the case may be.
whatever the case may be, yeah. And we do this, and we get lost in the language where we think the actual word is the thing itself. And that's the biggest problem, because the thing itself is nameless, is labelless. But we categorize and we define it to suit our own psychology.
To suit our own personal psychology. So the
Exactly.
thing to me would be to supersede that and step outside, because to me, when we get into that personal psychology, aren't we actually limiting ourselves, Jason?
We are limiting ourselves, yeah, definitely in that sense, because once we dive into our own personal psychology, then it is a limiting device, because you haven't allowed for every other defining aspect from beyond yourself and from the external world. So it's definitely a limiting apparatus. And, again, it comes back to self-work. It depends on how much you want to look into that, because it's not to say that we can get beyond the language. Saying, like, you will always use language, but the way that when you begin to look into your own personal psychology is you'll get beyond the saying of it. You can say, we can say, everything is one and oneness, but, in our gut and in our intelligence, a lot of the time, our gut feeling, we kind of feel that's off when some people say it, because they don't really feel that and they don't really know that. But when someone has a real abundant sense of unity within them and they can exclaim that everything is one, then in your gut, in your instinctual center, you sort of feel that, wow, that individual really does feel that. They do know that. So in a sense, language itself can be powerful if what the individual is saying actually knows it as and has internalized the understanding of some of those, especially spiritual concepts.
All right, I've got a really obtuse question for you.
Yep.
When we look at those ideas of separation and moving away from oneness, when one says they are one with all things, as an example, just as an example, and then when they place judgment upon other people, aren't they stepping into the realm of separation?
Yeah, definitely are, and you see this daily, Stephen. You see it in everyday conversation between, especially spiritual people. And like yourself, you've been around spiritual circles for quite some time, as I have, and you see this always perpetuated in spiritual circles. You'll see someone say that everything is one, everything is harmonious, and then when you go out to the car park, they're judging someone who was at the group or complaining about their wife or their husband to you, and you just think, well, you've gone way out of your center. And you see this, you always, I have a Catholic friend, and I speak to him, and he always says you always see this at church where, everything is great and harmonious and beautiful inside the cathedral, but once they get into the car park, it's on. It's really on. It's no one.
Game on.
Game on. Nothing sacred in that sense, So, like what you said, it loses it. And so, what I always say to people is, don't say those sort of things unless you truly know them. And that doesn't mean that you're a bad person. It doesn't mean that you can't say that I don't feel oneness. Everyone feels oneness at particular times of the day, whether they know it or not. But the difference between a sage and a warrior is there's a sense of unity. Now that sort of gets away from the kind of the New Age concepts of oneness, because a sense of unity is something that dawns upon your own consciousness. It's not something that you can go and sell and share with other people. You may sell and share it with them in the sense that if they're around you, they benefit from your own presence.
But that's the whole idea of the sage. I say to people all the time, if you're in some place like India, you never know who's standing next to you. No matter what they may appear to be, no matter what they attempt to look like, you never know who's standing next to you. It could be the greatest sage that ever lived just because of the way that they look. But see, to me, and that's really what we're talking about in the area of the science and practice of humility, and that's that the idea of the science and practice of humility, I would think one of the biggest things that anyone could do is to be able to move themselves away from having a judgmental mind.
Definitely. It's probably the most difficult thing for most people to do. I think it was James O'Day once said it was, the greatest evolutionary process that we'll undertake is getting over our own judgments. So, it is the constant work that we all have.
So it's really the judgments of mind that keep us in that warrior state of mind and keep us in the illusion of the idea of limitation in this reality that we call reality, if that makes sense. That we ourselves are choosing to operate in a realm in which we, now here I'm going to say this, in which we think we understand, and by that very understanding, aren't we doing nothing more nor less than producing something of levels of limitation, keeping it to us in the first place?
Definitely. That's a sort of a common the common memorandum for the whole world is to uphold that, and the judgments that we continually perpetuate, even internally that we don't express, are themselves affecting the world in a sense. And in any spiritual path, even though they say to get over the judgments and to work through the judgments, it doesn't mean in the sense that you will completely get over the judgments in the way that we have responses to the environment, meaning that, if a lion was running towards you, you have the faculties to know to get out of the way, so that you're not going to learn those. You're not going to. Yeah, sometimes you're not going to lose those discerning abilities, but it's the arbitrary judgment, you could say, that will decrease within your own state. And again, like what you said, if we continue to have those judgments, these are limiting devices, and it's almost these judgments, they are on the psychological level, so they do have a connection to the survival of the species, you can say, because we have this tendency to feel isolated from the universe, so we perpetuate our own judgments because that keeps us safe in our own comfort zones, physically, mentally, and spiritually. Okay,
but is it really a necessary attribute? I would have to believe that answer is no, or that response is no. It's not necessary. It's not a necessary thing to live by. To me, I think we've overused the idea of judgment. We've overkilled it. And what I mean by that is a very simple thing, in that when we place judgment that this tree is here and that tree is there, that's what allows us to walk between the two trees, is by using that level of judgment and, or if you will, discernment, to recognize the two trees and to be able to pass between them. When we start judging people, events, and circumstances, I think is where we make the error, so to speak. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And that's the problem. That's when, we take that level of judgment up until the human level, then it changes its mask totally, because it's not really a discerning faculty. It's more of a, you're projecting your own agendas upon the world. No one, people can say that they don't, but you can't escape that. Someone who lives in a lot of judgment are always doing that. And
well, I kind of like my judgment. Now, I'm being just totally facetious right now. No, because we don't. It has been found by myself and my own life that judgment is not that necessary when it comes to the personal side. When it comes to navigating through traffic, when it comes to navigating the business world, when it comes to walking through a forest, yes, I can see judgment and I can see its play. But on any other thing, I would have to think that for a moment in time that the biggest thing that keeps us away, if there's one, and I'm sure there's many, that keeps us away from the science of humility has got to be a judgmental mind.
It definitely is. That's what keeps us primarily away from it, because, as we have discussed, it's a limiting device, and you are always, when you're working through your own judgments, you are constantly separating yourself, not only within yourself but within the world. There's always that sense of separation. There is never that sense of unity, as we've spoken about, and it's categorically different to the human instinctual center, because the human instinctual center is just that gut feeling that we have. That's
sure.
totally different. I don't want the listeners to confuse that. It's the psychological judgments that are based, as you said, upon all of our conditioning and the way that we project ourselves upon the world. So, to get to the science and practice of humility, your eyes, in a sense, have to soften. Your glare has to soften. And this is a process that happens naturally and slowly if you're sincere in your own introspection, because you will not be drawn too much into the dramas of life. And in fact, you probably won't be drawn in at all, because most of the time there's nothing that you can do about a lot of the dramas in life. I heard a guru once in India say that. He said that, because one person they were very vexed by the evil in the world. And he said, thousands of years ago, we were all sitting in India here, and there were wars happening in the Middle East, but you weren't concerned about them because you didn't know about them. So what's the difference between now and then? And obviously, the advent of the TV and the internet and all that doesn't help in that sense. But what they are doing, in a sense, is bringing that ignored aspect of life to our eyes. But our job is to see it differently. And it's only when we can see it differently that we can transform problems in the world that we have.
But I would have to ask you, from a sage mind perspective, is there really any problems in the world? Isn't the world doing exactly what it's supposed to?
It's doing exactly what it's supposed to. This is interesting because, when you say to people, they get very uncomfortable when they talk about World War I and World War II and how they shouldn't have happened and this and that, and other atrocities in the past. A sage would say that's exactly what was supposed to happen. They might feel a bit uncomfortable with that response, but then when you can look into the response of the sage, think about it. You and I, Stephen, could not be talking here right now and doing what we're doing, and everyone else that's listening, if everything in the past has not happened. Now that's a big statement, but that's the truth.
But it's huge.
Yeah, it's huge. But that's the truth, because if all of that has not happened, we could not have the life that we have now. And I know a lot of people have died and a lot of people have suffered for that. But this is what the sage gets at. They get at that everything in the world is harmonious. It's already what it should be right now. Chaos is only perceived by the warrior mind, by the one who is caught in the detail. So, how can you retract from the gravitational pull of reality? How can you see it from a higher perspective? And you've got to get into softening your own consciousness, becoming more receptive, and then you will have that complete science of humility that they have, where you can see reality from a high perspective.
All right, I'd like to delve in that area for a moment. Softening your mind, softening your perspective, because so many people have such a harsh view of what reality is. Is that harsh view on reality brought about, Jason, by judgment?
Definitely. Judgment is one of the realms, and to soften the mind, you cannot do it if you're a very opinionated individual. And you would know this from observing. You only have to observe social media to see that it's more opinion book than Facebook, you could say. It's just people throwing opinions around rather than actually trying to understand someone's, perspective of life. If your mind was truly receptive and truly softened, as transparent and reflective as water, you would be able to approach anyone's situation in life and see it not only from your own sort of standpoint, but from their standpoint, how they see reality. And you cannot do that if you're a very judgmental individual. Because your mind, your consciousness is rock hard. It's stiff. It's rigid. There's no way that it can accept or see it from a different perspective.
But the mind in and of itself was never intended to be rigid, at least in the way that we operated. And I know it's the way that we're conditioned to. We have an interesting suggestion in the chat room. And Alakazam, I'm not quite sure I understand what you're saying or asking. Aren't forced to face the truth that you are on your own journey?
I don't quite understand the question.
Well, yeah, I'm asking the writer of the question to maybe rephrase it, because now they say you. I'm going to see if I can put this in my words, and Alakazam, you tell me if I'm on it or not. And that's this. If we force ourselves into facing what we perceive as the truth, is that still a segment or an idea of the fact that we are indeed on our own journey from the warrior side of being into the side of the sage? Does that fit better?
Yeah, that makes sense. It's an interesting question. I would say that that might be a little bit too much over analytical into it, because it's like if you were around a sage and you asked a sort of question, they would say probably just try and resonate with your highest desire. So if your highest desire is the truth, but you feel that it is discerned with in your own sort of path, then you're probably analysing it too much. I would say that if there is a fire inside you for the truth, just go for it, and in any way that will be, it'll be. That doesn't mean that you will always hold on to whatever your own path is. It may drop off in time. I always approach this to how Joseph Campbell said that you have to approach enlightenment and truth and everything like your head is on fire and you're looking for a watering hole. That you have to have that sort of passion, that drive.
Do you know what, my friend? My head has been on fire since I think the day I came into this reality.
It's scorched.
Yeah. But it's let's just say it's been bronzed, so to speak, more than maybe anything, because of the understanding and the pursuit. And I don't know if I really like even using that word, the pursuit. The pursuit of knowledge simply means you're pursuing something you don't have. And my teachers taught me that, you already have everything that is required of you to know and or understand. That's a difficult concept off the top to accept and to appreciate and to take place in. But we do all already know, when you say that gut feel, that's where that gut feel comes into play. Does that make sense, Jason?
It does make sense. It's that human instinctual center that we have, but we're just not connected to it because we are totally up in the mind. We're up in the head. We're not connected.
How can we be connected to anything, Jason, if we are constantly placing judgment and separating ourselves from it? How in the world can we ever become connected to the idea of the practice of humility when, I'm just going to go ahead and throw this out there, to a lot of people, the idea of humility is a sign of weakness. Have you ever run across that?
I definitely have. I actually came across it in the process of, discussing my book with people in India and Nepal and Thailand and all the places where I usually hang out. And they usually, when I discuss the science and practice of humility with them, they love it, but they often get into the idea that it's to do with humiliation more than something that's a virtue. So they often think of it as a weakness because they identify it with humiliation. And that's just again, that's from our social and cultural constraints that have conditioned us that way, to think that way. When
it's our social programming. I think you'd have to be in alignment with me to a great extent if I said to you that the Dalai Lama is probably one of the most humble people on this planet. And I don't see any weakness in that.
Well, look at everything that he's doing in the world. Look at from his state of perception and from his humbleness, look at everything he's done in the world. That's a sign of a virtue that is not of the personal or the psychological aspects of life. It's from somewhere else. That sounds metaphysical, but you can see this with anyone who has ascended to or worked enough within themselves to get to a certain level in life where there's an actual virtueness that is, you can't categorize it. It's beyond the manifest virtue of the world. It's a non-manifest virtue, and
I think my point though is in support of your book, The Science and Practice of Humility. That to me is just something that is what the Dalai Lama actually lives and is. It's not something he really has to consider and or think about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was getting to. It's not, you could say, when I was talking about virtue, it's not an induced virtue. It's just natural. It's his natural way of being that's just him. That's him. And he's embodied it all. It's like when you look at Sri Ramana Maharishi, when he lived in southern India, he embodied it all as well. And a lot of people often wondered, how could he just sit in quiet contemplation and happiness for so long? And it's because it's from that state, it's from that science that most of us, associate with weakness.
And which in reality, if I can give the listening audience an analogy, it would be this in relationship to what Jason is sharing with us. And that's that when a tree, if you watch Mother Nature, when the wind blows, the tree moves. And as the tree moves, it's actually getting exercise. You could say windercise. Why? Because the wind's blowing, and as the tree moves, that tree is gaining in strength. And as that tree gains in strength, it may one day decide that, the wind is blowing and I'm not going to move. And when that tree decides not to move, then I think that tree is probably going to end up on the ground because it no longer knew and or experienced its own level of humility. We as humans can become so rigid and so ensconced in a belief or an idea or an identity that we become totally inflexible. And I think humility, we could say in a sense, Jason, is more one of being flexibly accepting of yourself. What do you think?
Definitely. It's that, again, it's that radical openness, it's that receptivity, and when you can, especially when you can be that with yourself, then you've really got to a certain stage in your life that's it's unspeakable. So,
but that stage is available to every living human.
Well, it's our innate nature. That's our natural state. But we've been conditioned to feel that it's weakness, like what you said.
All right, but even in the idea of humility and the illusion of control, you still have that same collision, do you not?
Please say that again. You broke up a little bit there, Stephen.
Oh, I was just going to say, even in the idea of the illusion of control, that's another form of the warrior mind and having to make things be a certain way, which automatically puts us in conflict with ourselves, does it not?
It does. And that control it's an illusion. You only have to be observant of your own life to understand that control and even force they're just two aspects of our life that aren't real. You know, it's like what you said with the analogy. When the tree decides to stand still and be stiff, it's not completely over. It's lost its flexibility. And
Indeed.
Yeah.
Indeed. And when we as the human lose our flexibility, where does that leave the idea of humility? Humility, I think, is the greatest act of kindness that any of us can offer, not only to ourselves, but to other living humans. Is that kind of in alignment with where Jason is going and presenting in his book?
Definitely. That's one of the prime reasons that the book came into existence. And it's like what we were just discussing about control. It's getting over our own delusion that we can control the world and just accept the world. And once you start to accept the world, you begin to accept yourself. It's just the way it is. In accepting the world, you are accepting yourself. There's no sort of separation there. So once you get rid of that rigid control that you think that you have, that you possess, and then that real humility will flower. You know, the idea of force and control in this world have been perpetually upheld, even from our educational systems, where, you know, we're not really taught about how to express ourselves naturally through art or anything like that, but instead we're taught about how, you know, heroes, so-called heroes in the world, controlled their situation and promoted it on other people. And I think that's a great injustice to the young people in the world, especially.
Well, but it's that indoctrinating program that we all have the propensity to go through, grow through, or however it is that you want to say that. But it's that internal conflict will never really allow for the science and practice of humility. Notice how I keep getting your book title in there?
Yeah, thanks for that.
Oh, of course. But doesn't that make sense, though?
It does make sense. It makes perfect sense.
It's the internal conflict that we all seemingly, and believe it or not, I'm going to go ahead and say this, it's like we almost enjoy creating the conflict so we have something to do.
I'd say that's 100% right. I think one big problem with humanity is most people are predominantly bored. So they fill their life with unnecessary dramas, and usually from within themselves. So, if you're...
I love the way that you said that, predominantly bored. I've got a seemingly obtuse question for you. When's the last time you were bored?
I don't know. It's hard to even put a finger on it.
Okay. No, wait. I'm with you. I think people are bored because of the idea of the material world and the identity and how they identify themselves as a physical-only being without any meaning. That means basically now life is meaningless.
Yeah, but that's beautifully put.
All right, but you, like myself and like my co-host who's said a whole lot on the show tonight, we don't do that.
No.
We go in the other direction. We find the meaning of our own being. And in Jason's book, I've had the pleasure of reading it. It's an awesome book, and I'm looking forward to when it comes out. And that's The Science and Practice of Humility, because that's what we're talking about. There's nothing inappropriate about being humble. There's nothing inappropriate about being, a constant, perpetual state of living grace. What do you think?
Oh, there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's beautiful. And, you know, like what you were saying, Stephen, and you know, all of us three would know, there's nothing wrong with sitting in silence for however long you want to do it. There's nothing wrong with that. People say that, but I get bored. It doesn't achieve anything. And I tell you what, you'll achieve much more sitting 1 hour silent than you will, you know...
being bored for an hour.
Yeah, exactly.
I love it. Hey, Liara, do you have any questions for Jason? I mean, forgive me, we haven't I know you're here, but you're not involved in the conversation, so let me drag you in.
Well, I'm sincerely enjoying the exchanges that are going on here, and I am participating telepathically, of course. That never ends. Telepathically is silence. But I really appreciate the sage warrior analogy, and it's a wonderful one because it brings in the disciple guru analogy essentially, and that is that the sage knows that there is actually no warrior mind, and that the warrior eventually realizes he is the sage. And the process that Jason is exploring in his book is inviting everyone to recognize that the illusion of separation is the greatest illusion of all, because it's something that convinces people that they have to seek humility. And I guess my question for Jason, and a point of reflection for our listeners, is what would you invite people to stop doing rather than do in order to experience humility?
What would you said? What would people stop doing? Because it broke up a little bit there, Liara.
No, actually, Jason, she's into the Tao of Wu Wei and the idea that you presented in that book on the idea of non-doing.
Ah, okay. Well, it's what would people have to do to get to that sort of stage? Is you're going to have to really be sincere with yourself and see how you are inside yourself and how you act with other people. And like what we were talking about before, it's exploring the boredom. Exploring that boredom and get into that stage of that in actually, we all know this, but in meditation and other sort of practices, when you meditate, even though you are calming the mind for a certain amount of time and this and that does much more good than anything that you could do in 10 hours of the day by running around, doing errands, arguing with people or whatever. That half an hour that you may sit in quiet contemplation and in silence will achieve much more. And that, again, comes into the non-doing aspect of reality and comes into that, that's a whole aspect of reality we haven't even really acknowledged, most individuals in the world. It's that feminine aspect of the world. It's that yin aspect where it's very soft, it's water-like, it's receptive, like much of the things that we've been talking about today. And I'd say align with that more, explore that. Don't think that that's weakness. If someone's going to call you an idiot, accept it. Don't accept it passively, but accept it and just contemplate. Well, maybe I am an idiot. Who knows? But
hey, wait a second. You would be an idiot to that person, but a genius to someone else.
Well, exactly. That's an old. It sounds like an old Zen koan, actually. That one.
It is.
But it is, yeah.
That's the reason I kind of threw that in there.
Yeah.
It's just because... Go ahead.
No, and I feel that, a lot of people will get that out of the science and practice of humility it's the acceptance of that feminine aspect of the universe that we all have innately within us. That's not a trait that's isolated to a woman. It's within all of us. And, it's accepting that. And, when you start to accept that, you become, you're more complete in life. You listen better in conversations. You're more present when someone is speaking to you. You're just more present. And that's what we should be trying to get as an individual, because we are predominantly asleep during the day rather than being completely present. People turn on the TV or daydream and this and that, and then they wonder, wow, what happened to the day? But when you're completely present, you can reflect upon the day and go, wow, that was a really awesome day, and I achieved a lot, and I learned a lot just from being completely present in that moment and accepting life and just flowing with it, but not being asleep.
Okay, we're down to the last few moments of the show here. And I'm going to give a plug for the next week's guest, which is going to be Simran Singh. That's SimranSingh, and I would say Google her name, because you're going to be in for another treat that's going to enhance a lot of what Jason has shared with us this evening. But Jason, in a few short words, if possible, any suggestions on people breaking these, I'm going to say, being asleep while they are awake? Any suggestions on that for the audience?
Look inside yourself and sincerely observe the way you are, and get into what truly is meditation. Meditation is being completely present right here and right now. Though you may feel that is boredom, that is the only place that we actually exist. We cannot get out of the present moment. So, to look into the past and into the future to try and escape your boredom and your state of sleep. Embrace this new idea. It's not even a new idea. The ancient idea of meditation and being completely present here and now, because it's only in that state that you'll be able to truly love unconditionally and accept yourself in the world.
Awesome. We have a comment in the chat room, which I'm just going to bring up and say, I don't think I'm really going to respond to, but here's what it is. I was preoccupied today in the bank and it got robbed. Was it good that I wasn't paying attention? What my response to that is it's never a positive idea when a person is not paying attention because they are asleep, which is exactly what Jason is talking about. Being asleep while your eyes are wide open and while you are wide awake. If a person had been paying attention and was consciously aware, they would have had a modicum of an idea that this was going to go down. I mean, let me give you something ridiculous for a moment. But let's just say you are in the month of August and you see a guy in a trench coat in a bank. Well, you got a problem. Why? Because the trench coat in the month of August does not necessarily fit. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jason Gregory. And Jason, you're always welcome to be on the show at any time with us. And hopefully we'll do this again before your book actually comes out, because I enjoy the conversations and the knowledge that's being portrayed. Ladies and gentlemen, all the concepts and precepts that are being offered on the show are just a simple thing. Practice. It's a practice, not something serious. It's just a practice. Does that make sense, Jason?
It makes perfect sense. And, like you said, it's practice. It's not, like you said, it's not taking things too serious. It's not being your own dictator about life and yourself. It's about just practicing, the truth of your own existence and living it. And, that'll change the world. And I'd like to say, I've enjoyed this conversation with both of you guys today. And, we'll do it again in the future, I guess.
I hope we can do that soon. And Jason, you have a good journey. We're always here. So if there's any way that we can assist you, then let me know. And ladies and gentlemen, tune in next week at the same time for Ms. Simran Singh. And all of you have a great week. And Jason, I look forward to any future conversations that we can have. Thank you so much, my friend. Have a great week.
Thank you.